Biden administration released an updated assessment on al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, citing intelligence community reports that the terror group is no longer assessed to be a threat in that country. Tomorrow marks 1 year since the chaotic collapse of the Afghan government as U.S. troops prepared to leave. And while the administration's full report on the much criticized withdrawal is still a work in progress, the top Republican of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Michael McCaul's report, is complete. He's here with us. Good morning to you, Congressman.
Thanks, Margaret. Thanks for having me.
This deserves a full conversation, and I want to get to it. Let me do this bit of business, though, first on the events of the past few days. Senator Marco Rubio, who's the vice chair of Senate Intelligence, issued a letter saying he was outraged not to have been briefed, and he blasted the FBI, saying that they have done more damage to faith in the rule of law than the Russian Federation or any other foreign adversary. Is his anger misplaced?
You know, I think it comes on the heel. I think the Wall Street Journal did a great article about how, after the Russian collusion, Steele dossier, everything that took place during the Trump presidency and now out of office to have this raid take place. Look, I'm a DOJ alumni. I worked at Public Integrity here at Maine Justice. And what I worry about, Margaret, is the lack of trust and faith in our institutions. That concerns me most above all. And I think when you saw the DHS bulletin about, potential threats now to the agents, this is the whole fabric of our democracy. And they have lost faith. Many have in the FBI and our institutions. I hate to see that as a former federal prosecutor.
Understood. And there is something like a healthy skepticism about law enforcement, certainly, but for the former president to be using the language that he is when there is this level of threat against FBI agents, would you call on him to tone it down?
I think it's inflammatory. I don't want to put any law enforcement in the bullseye of a potential threat. I'm someone who's worked with law enforcement most of my career. This is an extraordinary case. And what lawyers, we call a case of first impression. We've never had a former president of the United States serve with a search warrant. There was a subpoena. The court could have enforced the subpoena. That should have been a last stage process. And I agree with Brian Fitzpatrick, right? Mm-hmm. The affidavit in support of the warrant will give you the probable cause to try to understand what is going on here. And I think the American people deserve this. And I certainly think, to Rubio's point, that the Gang of Eight should have been briefed, and I believe that the relevant committees on the Hill should have access to the documents, but most importantly, this affidavit.
Yeah. Well, we will see. It sounds like it may take some time to get some of these answers. I want to talk to you about Afghanistan. I've read your report. The State Department says there are about 74,000 vulnerable Afghans still stuck waiting for these visas to exit the country, who worked with the United States government. Your report says the State Department knew, going back well into the Trump administration, that it needed more staff, that it needed more resources to even begin to help get these people out. And that's before the chaos of the withdrawal. Mm-hmm. Is that one of the prime sort of sins here that you see in terms of failure to plan? There
are many sins, if you will. There was a complete lack and a failure to plan. There was no plan, and there was no plan executed. And to your point, even beforehand, I think the State Department probably didn't have the resources it needed to carry out an evacuation of this size and enormity. They had 36 consular officers at HKIA trying to process hundreds of thousands of people. They were overwhelmed, but there are so many mistakes. The biggest one, Margaret, for me, having lived through it, being in the classified space, listening to the intelligence community tell the story about this is going to be imminent. It's going to fall sooner rather than later. The military told us the same thing. And then we went to state, and they paint in the White House a very rosy picture. There's a disconnect between intelligence on the ground and what the White House is doing. I think in this report, this says it all. Like, there's no way we're going to evacuate embassy personnel from helicopters like we did in Vietnam. Yeah. And of course, we know that happened.
Well, the criticism of this report will be that this was the minority report, that it's inherently political. And that when the Republicans take the majority, if they win the majority in November, that this is going to be just a political line of attack. How do you respond to that?
I was a federal prosecutor longer than a member of Congress, so it's been almost 20 years now. And I pride myself as being objective. I think this is a fairly objective report about the failures that were made. You know, one of the biggest ones was that the Taliban, sitting with his colleagues out of the special envoy, and General McKenzie, the CENTCOM commander, made an offer. You can take control over Kabul and secure it for purposes of the evacuation.
And General McKenzie said, that's not my assignment here.
Not my assignment. That's not what the commander-in-chief told me. They do run it up to the White House, and they get no response. And then later, Jen Psaki says they wouldn't have approved that. Think about what that would have changed. We had to rely on the Taliban to secure the perimeter of HKIA. That led to the chaos. It also led to the suicide bomber that killed 13 service members, men and women, and injured over hundreds of people. Mm-hmm. And it could have been avoided.
You know, the current U.S. Special Envoy for Afghan women and girls was out of government when this was going on. She's quoted in your report as saying she still struggles to understand how this supposedly pre-planned, negotiated, inevitable withdrawal ended the way it did. It feels so much like living Schindler's List. That's a pretty powerful criticism. Who specifically needs to be held accountable, if anyone here? And is it simply just the matter of this was an intelligence failure, that the government would fall as quickly as it did, that the former president would have fled? How do you respond to that, that there was an inability to plan for this because it was not predicted?
Well, the intelligence community got it right. So there's no failure on the intelligence side, nor the Pentagon. They called it right. The problem was the White House and State Department putting their head in the sand, not wanting to believe what they were saying, and therefore not adequately planning. And I think, to your point, the women left behind is the worst of this entire story. I got 4 busloads of little girls from a music school out, but the Schindler's List, you know, if you're on the list, you're going to live. If you're not on the list, you're probably going to die. 100,000 Afghan partners left behind. Remember, we said we will protect you. That was our promise to them. No one left behind, and we left them behind to the mercy of the Taliban, and now they're being tortured and killed.
Well, the State Department says that it has tried to comply with your committee. We await their full report of their own actions. Thank you for sharing your findings today.
They have not complied with our investigation at all.
Congressman, thank you for your time today.